Good morning and welcome to our second webinar in our series on GDPR. Today we're going to be talking about compliance for marketing. Before we get started, I just want to take a moment to acclimate everybody to the console. You may or may not have attended webinars with the On24 platform, so if you have, great. If not, I'm just going to take a couple of seconds. You can resize any of the boxes on your screen. That media player is going to adjust the volume for you, which you have to be listening through your computer speakers. If you have any questions throughout the presentation, feel free to enter them into that Q&A box and submit, and we will get around to those throughout the presentation. You can click on those logos up in the upper left for more information about Acton and Technology Advisors. And then at the bottom of your screen, you have what are called widgets, these little pictures. Starting from the right, you have that little headshot there. And if you click on that, it'll open up the speaker bios for David and I and the contact addresses. And then next to that is a resource list where we have Acton's recent guide on managing consent for GDPR, and then also a 12-step instructional manual on preparing for GDPR that you can download at any time throughout the presentation. So with that, I would like to get started. So let's start by introducing myself and our presenter. My name is Deneen. I'm the Marketing Manager for Technology Advisors. And with us today, we have David Fowler, who is the Head of Privacy and Digital Compliance at Acton Software. So David is the ideal candidate to be telling us about this information today. So we're very excited to have him with us. Just a disclaimer, gotta do this for legal purposes. We cannot provide legal advice or consulting pertaining to GDPR or other compliance issues. Customers should consult their legal teams and resources to ensure they are aware of their obligations under applicable regulations. So our agenda for today, we're going to recap kind of the general premises of GDPR. Then we're going to dive into compliance as it relates to marketing data. We're going to look at marketing automation and GDPR as a particular segment of that. And then we're going to talk about reducing the impact of GDPR in your marketing. What steps can you take? What things should you be considering as you move forward with that? So with that, I would like to turn the floor over to David.
Thank you, and good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depending where you are on the planet. Thank you for joining us today. Let's pop over to the next slide. I'm really happy to be here. Let's talk a little about the GDPR recap, which is something that I'm living and breathing almost on a daily basis now. So essentially, the current state of play within the European Union up until next month is that the EU operates under what's called the 1995 Data Directive. And the Data Directive is not a law. It's an interpretation of certain behaviors and certain applicable issues under, under the European Union guidance. And really what that has done is really presented a situation where the member states can interpret the directive into local law. So what you end up happening is you have this jigsaw puzzle of interpretations of the data directive, how to operate your digital business within the European Union, which is different in each country. So essentially, if you're marketing to Germany today compared to marketing the UK, you're going to have different challenges, etc. So what the GDPR does, it's going to replace the directive, and it creates a universal law for adoption throughout the European Union. So it's really it's a massive game changer in terms of legislation. Obviously, they've been operating under the 95 directive, and here we are in 2018. So essentially, it's the most significant change in privacy law in the last 20 years. And the big one for us here in the US is that it imposes the obligations on any business that handles data on EU citizens. So essentially, in a nutshell, if you have one email address from a European data subject, then you as American companies or Canadian companies, or Australian companies, or Japanese countries, etc., have to comply to the GDPR. And obviously today we're talking about marketing, but there are many, many other facets of GDPR that do go across the depth and breadths of every organization. The other thing that's going through Europe right now is what's called the e-privacy directive. And so part of the 1995 data directive was essentially a cookie law that came into effect. And really, they're going to essentially rewrite the cookie law that is currently in play. Now, we're keeping an eye on that because that has a bit more, I would say, of an impact for businesses who rely on those types of technologies to operate, which is pretty much all of us. So essentially, is GDPR kicks in May. The e-privacy directive is sort of the sister of that legislation. It's been pushed out a little bit, probably until maybe January of 2019. But when that does go into effect, and it will go into effect, it's going to change the way that permission and consent is gained for companies that use cookie technology for tracking and purposes of the like. So that's going to be a big one to keep our eye on. But today we're going to talk about GDPR. So the question is, what about the Brexit? And obviously there's a lot of focus around that in terms of them leaving the European Union. And the reality is that they will adopt the GDPR prior to their exiting the European Union, and then we'll have to see what happens after that. So if you have UK subjects in your databases today, you are still going to be complying to the GDPR. Just a point of reference, we as a company have over 500 clients in Europe today currently. So it's something that we have spent a tremendous amount of time thinking about, and obviously getting to the point of adoption.
David, a question has come in. They're asking, so if I have one person in my database from the EU, does that mean I'm under full GDPR compliance?
Correct. Yeah, so first of all, let me just give you my personal opinion here of this thing. It's not sort of Y2K version 2, and those of us who are old enough to remember Y2K, myself included, it's a situation where I think if you have one subject or one email address, you're going to, in terms of being on the radar for any sort of regulatory or data protection authority activity, is going to be exceedingly low, right? But what the GDPR does, it forces down the consent landscape to all the people and organizations that touch that particular individual. So really, we operate in an opt-out world here in the U.S., and obviously in most parts of the other parts of the world, it's more of an opt-in association, right? You can't market to someone until you get their permission and consent. And so really, I think from a common sense perspective, some of the tenets of GDPR are things that we as digital organizations should be thinking about anyway, right? So the same thing is in play with CASL, Canadian anti-spam legislation. If you have one Canadian email address on your list in Canada, then you're still theoretically supposed to comply to CASL as well. So there is a fundamental shift in terms of being able to be compliant or demonstrate compliance. And one of the things of GDPR is if you can demonstrate that you're trying to comply, then essentially you're complying. So we can get into that a little bit later, but things like sign-up processes, asking customers where they're coming from, making sure that if someone's logging in or visiting your website from a European country, you know about that, and put the necessary mechanisms in place to be compliant around that. But that's a great question, because it does create some level of concern initially, but the reality is that this whole thing is going to take a long time to play out from a compliance and regulatory perspective, meaning just as we saw here in the US with CAN-SPAM, when CAN-SPAM went into effect in 2004, it took several years before you started to see any kind of legal activity or any kind of lawsuits that were brought against marketers and the like based on the interpretation of that particular regulation. So good news is this thing is coming. Bad news, it's a burden for us all. But the reality is, at the end of the day, some of the things that are in the bill are just really common sense approach for managing your digital sort of footprint anyway. But keep those questions coming, and we'll be more than happy to give you some insights on that as we get into the presentation. So one of the things, the biggest things in terms of the GDPR is sort of which side of the data fence you sit on or you reside on, right? Whether you are a data controller or whether you're a data processor. And under the GDPR, data controller is essentially a person who determines the purposes of which and the manner of any personal data are to be possessed. So in the case of Act-On, if you were an Act-On client, you would be the controller and we would be the processor, because essentially you would be uploading into our platform your data and you would make the determination of how that data is used. And so it's important to understand which side of that fence you're on, because your obligations could be a bit different depending on if you're a controller or a processor. If you're a controller, you're more on the hook for the management of GDPR. If you're the processor, then you are on the hook, but not as deep as you would be if you actually own the relationship. So companies like us who have a marketing automation platform, which use our marketing automation platform to market, we are both. In some instances, we are a processor, and some instances, we are a controller. So our marketing department would be the controller, and the rest of the organization would be the processor. So it's important to understand where you sit on that fence, because, as I said earlier, you do have some issues that you have to understand and adopt as you move forward.
David,
so
another
we're going to go
question
down.
has come in.
Yeah, sure.
Oh, so you mentioned that Canada is adopting rules similar to this, and that obviously the EU is adopting this. Is this based on your expertise, anything that you foresee might be coming to the U.S. at some time that we might adopt something similar to this?
That's another great question. Canada was the last sort of G8 country that introduced email legislation, which essentially went into effect 2 years ago, but it had been on the books for a number of years prior to that. And some would say it's probably one of the most restrictive pieces of email legislation that has been introduced on a global scale. In the U.S., we are a secular, in terms of our privacy laws, they're more focused on a business model as opposed to blanket coverage. So think about things like HIPAA if you're on the medical space. Think about COPPA if you deal with kids. Think about Graham Leach Blaley if you're dealing with financial services, etc. So my personal feeling is I don't foresee a universal privacy blanket that gets introduced into the U.S. anytime soon. What you may see are things like the tenets of permission, meaning more opt-in type activities around marketing efforts, but we don't have them yet, right? So, consent is the essence of the digital relationship. If you don't have consent, then theoretically, you can't start to forge that relationship moving forward. So, the appetite, I think, for universal privacy legislation in America is pretty low at this point in time. However, you may see, because of some of the tenets of GDPR, meaning things like cross-border data transfer, that has to be in play. So if you're a company in the U.S., one of your obligations is to have a secure methodology for transferring data from European Union to the U.S. And that program is now called what's called the Privacy Shield. There are a couple other mechanisms too, but the most common methodology is to self-certify with the government in a program called the Privacy Shield, and that is an accepted methodology of transferring data from Europe back to the U.S. Now, if that transfer mechanism should disappear for some reason, whatever reason that might be, then we as data managers could find ourselves in a situation where we may have to be struggling to find a more adaptive way. So to put that into context, if you have European customers, European clients are very concerned about their data leaving the EU for very specific reasons. And if you cast your mind back 2 or 3 years ago for the shenanigans of Edward Snowden and the NSA, etc., there is a historical appetite to keep your data in Europe. So Act-On, we have co-locations in Frankfurt and Ireland if we have clients who want to stay over there. If we don't, and we operate our business over here, our Privacy Shield certification is adequate data transfer mechanism. So it really depends at the end of the day on how sort of restrictive or how conservative your customer is in terms of their understanding of where their data should be. So universal privacy legislation in the U.S. probably not anytime soon. Would you see a fine-tuning of business practices in terms of more consent-based mechanisms? It wouldn't surprise me if that was the case. And the reality is now anyway, is if you're an email marketer and you are, in that channel, you are sending, you're being held accountable for information, regardless if you're a lead acquisition or, a mailer versus a retention-based mailer, you're still held accountable for retention-based practices anyway. So it's almost happening by default. And it's forcing companies to understand, where they acquire their data, how old that data is, et cetera, et cetera. So, sorry, long-winded answer to the question, but I think ultimately, best practices will suffice, and that's kind of how we operate over here.
Excellent. Thank you, David.
So cut me off with the cut-off button if I start going on a rampage. So I'll give myself a minute to answer the questions we move forward. Okay. All right. So let's talk about some really high-level things as we, as marketers, need to get our house in order in relationship to the GDPR. And one of the big things is, and when I talk about this moving forward, I want you guys to think about what I would term to be low-hanging fruit of compliance. And let me put that in context a little bit, because the reality is that we're all marketers on the phone, and we have one vision of GDPR. If you had the techies on the phone, you'd have a different obligation as you would if you had HR, data, etc. But low-hanging fruit of compliance are things that can be tracked very easily, not to be in compliance. And let me put that in text of an email, for example. An email in the U.S., as you know, you have to have certain criteria within the body of the message. You can't be, you have to have a working unsubscribe mechanism. You have to have your physical address and the email address. You have to have a working opt-out, etc. If you don't have those things in your messages, those are things that easily can come up on the radar. And if you're a regulator, you can look at that and go, oh, okay, that opt-out's not working. Let me contact the organization, and then that could lead into a deeper discussion that you may or may not be ready to have, right? And so when you think about GDPR, you have to think about the low-hanging fruit of that type of compliance entities. And one of the big one is the data audit, right? So we as marketers, we need to have fully documented what kind of data that we hold, where we got it, when it was acquired, how often it's updated, all the places that it's stored within the organization, how the data flows from one place to another, who has access to the data throughout its journey, how it's stored, where it's stored, and the retention policy that you have. And so that's essentially just a data audit, right? And think about, multiple brands or multiple companies within an organization. They probably have data silos that are sitting all over the place. So what GDPR does is it forces you to audit your data from a controller's perspective, as opposed from a processor's perspective. So if you're sitting on a ton of data, you need to understand all these things. And the reality is that, if you're, for example, using a CRM tool and you plug that CRM tool into another organization, there are certain handoffs or handshakes that you can occur based on how that data gets into your cloud, right? So it's forcing the data management and the data audit down to really at the ground roots level, right? So if you're sitting on email addresses that you've had for 5 years, you're not emailing to them anymore, what's the point of keeping that around, right? You need to get rid of it. So it's trying to get organizations be better data stewards as it relates to their efforts around, as it relates to their efforts under GDPR as well. The data audit is a really big one. From an awareness perspective, there's a couple of things that you need to be really cognizant about. And the thing is that consumers now are going to have a lot more power or a lot more rights to sort of navigate or manage their own digital experience, right? So they can withdraw consent from processing. So, they can opt out, which when I say opt out, I'm just not referring to email opt out. I'm, referring to other types of messaging as well. They can request a copy of all their data. So, if you're a processor and you have a ton of European customers, they can reach out to you and say, give me all my data back, show me what you have. They can request the ability to move their data to a different organization, what's commonly known as data portability. So they have the right to come into an organization and say, I want my data back, and you as a processor have to be, as a controller, have to be able to give them back their data in a machine-readable format that they then can take to another organization and insert their data into another organization. They can request that you delete the information they consider no longer relevant. So, for example, let's say, I like to have emails or other types of marketing activities about certain types of clothing, but I don't want, I want jeans, but I don't want sweaters, for example, and that's a very granular example. But the point being is that someone's going to ask that question, which is no longer relevant to them, right? So, under GDPR, you've got to be in a position to be able to honor that request. And then the big one is the objective automated decision-making processes, including profiling. So if you're doing any kind of profiling on customers, and not meaning, think about things like Amazon, right? So you bought a book, and hey, I'm glad you bought the cooking book. There are other people shopping that have bought this book. You might like that book, for example. That's an example of profiling. So if you're doing any kind of that kind of exercising in your product sets, you need to be able to think about how you could stop that from the consumer perspective. So that's going to be massive. The regulator side of the world, right? So in Europe, over here, the Federal Trade Commission regulates the digital marketplace, right? So they are the ombudsman for all things, legislative-wise around the any kind of action that may come to you as a marketer or come to me as a marketer. And that would be the first place who would knock on the door. In Europe, every country has essentially identified what's called a Data Protection Authority, right? DPA. And when you combine all the DPAs together, you'll hear this term called the Working Party 29, right, or the Working Party of the EU. And essentially what the Working Party is, are all these data protection authorities coming together, sharing information on the tenants and their understanding of GDPR, right? It's more of a consultancy as opposed to a actual, black and white law or an interpretation of the law. So the Working Party is, how do I apply the tenets of data audits within, for example, Greece or Italy, right? So sharing best practices. But what they'll also do is they are basically going to be the conduit to essentially facilitate any kind of complaints that come in from end users or data subjects, as they call them within the European Union. And if they knock on your door and they ask a question, they can ask for records of processing activities and proof of steps taken to comply with the GDPR. So, if someone knocked on our door today here at Act On, we've done many things over the last year in preparation for May. We can demonstrate our ability to comply and having to comply as well. So that's it. That's obviously a pretty big deal. They could also impose temporary data processing bans, require data breach notification in order to erase of personal data. So essentially, we here don't like the government getting into our business model too much. Over there, they're going to get into the sandbox, and I'm going to talk about how that happens in a minute. But they can also suspend cross-border data flow, and the big one is essentially enforcing penalties of up to 20 million euros or 4% of annual revenues for non-compliance. So if you're Facebook or Uber or Microsoft or Amazon and you're in non-compliance, you could be fined 4% of your total annual revenue globally, which, as you know, is $1 gazillion. Or could be $1 gazillion. Now, we don't know what the regulator is going to do, right? So some of the regulators are more active than others. So if you, for example, if you have customers in the UK, The regulator in the UK is the Information Commissioner's Office, and they've been extremely active in terms of just getting everyone ready for GDPR around advice, publications, your guidance, etc. So again, that's a good place to go to if you have any kind of interpretation of what your obligations are. But the point being is that some of these regulators are going to be more active than others, and depending on where you're located within the European Union, if you actually have an office over there, you might want to try and track down who your particular DPA is going to be and start doing some research around that. One of the things of the GDPR too is that you have to have what's called a DPO, a data protection officer. That is on if you're an organization that has 250 employees or more, you are required to have a DPO on staff, or you could actually subcontract the DPO. And what the DPO essentially is responsible for, your compliance under GDPR for all things data protection. Now that employee does not necessarily report to your organization. They have a cross-reporting function into the DPA, the Data Protection Authority. So essentially what you have is you have on staff essentially an extension of the DPA within your organization. And, that's going to be a very interesting relationship when we start to see this thing in real time, because the point being is that, is this going to facilitate creativity, product development, or is it going to stifle that? So we've got some things to think about. So consumers have a lot more power. Regulators are going to have a lot more power than they currently do. So that's something to keep in mind as well. So what organizations have to do, like ourselves on the phone here, implement things like privacy by default and privacy by design, which are concepts that if you are rolling out new products and services, you have to think about how your GDPR compliance requirements are going to be incorporated into those types of products and services. That's a pretty big lift if you are in the product development world. You have to maintain appropriate data security, which again is a no-brainer, right? You should be doing that anyway. But this sort of starts making you think about, if you had a data breach, for example, under the GDPR, you have to notify the data protection agencies and consumers of data breaches within 72 hours of a known breach to be compliant. So that's a pretty heavy lift for a lot of companies if they don't necessarily know where their data is, or they don't necessarily have good security mechanisms in place either. You have to get appropriate consent for most personal data collection and provide notification of personal data processing activities. So, hey, send me your email address, so opt in here, fill out this form. This is exactly what I'm going to do with it. You have to disclose exactly the processing activities that you're going to implement on the data that you collect. You cannot have any pre-check boxes on sign-up forms anymore whatsoever, whether that be on email or form creation. And you have to disclose in very clear English or whatever language you're using that, hey, this is what I'm going to do with your data, and you have the right to opt out at any particular time. So think about forms and email addresses, emails, etc., with links to your privacy policies on there, statements of consent, etc., etc. And if you're in a very high level or a very highly sensitive data collection, for example, you might be in the medical field, you may need additional consent guidance to obtain that kind of data. You need to get a parent's consent to collect data for kids under 16. Some countries will be under 14, so there's a more level of activity there. But the reality is, if you're marketing your kids anyway, why wouldn't you want to give consent before you did that, right? And then you have to keep records of all processing personal information. So, what is it you held? What are you doing with it? What's the shelf life? When do you get rid of it? Et cetera, et cetera. Again, we talked about the DPO earlier, but, if you, do you have a question, I think?
Oh, did you hear me on
Okay.
mute? Yes, we do have two questions. One is asking, regarding the website forms, do we need a checkbox for them to click opt-in?
Yes. Yes. If you are obtaining or requesting consent any way that I could opt into your program, and that could be opt-in form. That could be a visit to your booth at a convention center or a convention. It could be a coupon in a magazine. Yeah, you need to be able to demonstrate that you've gotten that consent legally. So opt-in forms, opt-in box on a form or obtaining data is certainly something that you should be thinking about. You cannot have on that form, you cannot have a pre-check box, right? So you can't assume consent anymore. So you have to have a proactive opt-in when you collect that data, yes.
And the other question also relates to forms and opt-in. Will I need to have everyone opt back into my mailing list after GDPR goes into effect?
So that's the $25,000 question. So it really depends on the side of the fence that you sit on, right? Meaning, if you have opt-ins today and you can prove that you have that consent, then no, you don't need to re-opt-in your clients, right? Now, having said that, if you choose to go down a re-permissioning campaign, then there's a good likelihood that you might lose a certain piece of your database. I have seen big brands in Europe today implement re-permissioning campaigns in preparation for GDPR. And then, it really depends on, what your strategy is, the type of customers you have, but yes, I mean, the burden of consent relies on you. So if you get taken to court or you have to go to the DPA's office and you can't show the opt-in, then you'll be in non-compliance. Now, having said that, of course, does that have to happen by May 25th? Can you get creative and think about ways that you could maybe implement a sending strategy or an opt-in strategy that exceeds that date? You think about companies that have, multiple amounts of triggered-based emailing campaigns that are based on, activity, et cetera. So that could be a heavy lift for some organizations, right? I can tell you that our marketing department had 400 triggered email campaigns loaded in, and so for someone to go in there and redesign everything, it's a big ask, and it can be a big undertaking. So again, not being able to provide legal advice to you, but what I mentioned earlier about low-hanging fruit of low-hanging fruit of compliance, if you can't prove consent, that is an automatic, that's an automatic door opener for anyone to walk in and say, oh, well, if you don't have consent, what else don't you have, right? So sort of beware on that one. But a good question. Another thing that organizations have to do is take responsibility for the security and processing activities of third-party vendors. So if you're doing any kind of third-party vendor relationship, that vendor has to agree to GDPR, right? So that has again, I spoke earlier about the consent mechanism being forced down the food chain for all vendors in the food chain to get aligned. To that point, Act On uses vendors to help our business in Europe. Last year, we went through an exercise where we identified all the vendors we had. We approached each vendor and said, we need you to sign this GDPR compliance paperwork to ensure that you're compliant with us and with our customers. That's a big undertaking. That took months to happen. So again, you could see where this whole thing is shaping out, making sure that if you came back to Act On and said, could you comply with GDPR, we would, of course, say yes back to you. But that's what you have to do, and that's really something that is different than we have been used to before. So companies that could agree to that are continuing business relationships with us, and companies that can't, we've had to find other mechanisms and other opportunities there to move forward. So again, that's different for everyone, but it shouldn't be, it shouldn't come to a shock that if you're dealing with Amazon, for example, and you ask them about GDPR, they will have paperwork for you to sign, and they will have paperwork for you to sign. So definitely in this together, right? Institute safeguards for cross-border data transfers. We talked about that before in terms of privacy shield, etc. Consult regulators before certain processing activities. So this is where it kind of gets a little sticky, right? And if you're a big enough company and you have a DPO, data protection officer on staff, that individual may have to go back to the regulator and say, okay, company A is going to be thinking about doing this, what's the risk involved here? So essentially, you're opening up your product door to the government to walk in and start looking around, which I happen to think is going to be very interesting from a just a relationship perspective between that the DPO and, for example, the CMO, right? And I actually wrote an article about that. But I think it's one of those things where it sounds great in practice, in principle, but in practice, it's going to be a bit of a bumpy road. And then finally, you have to be able to, demonstrate compliance on demand, and that's something that that's going to be different for every company, right? So, attending this webinar, for example, is an example of how you're trying to comply, right? You're trying to educate yourself about the GDPR, you're trying to understand what's coming, et cetera, and that's something that a lot of companies will either struggle with or they won't. They'll either they'll understand their obligations or they won't care about it, depending on how big you are. And so, when these regulatory issues start to happen, and you start to see judicial type decision making based on GDPR, it's going to happen in the bigger organizations first, right? And by the time it gets down to the smaller companies, we're going to be well into 2019 and beyond. So if one thing, start to think about these things that you have obligations for, and sort of do due diligence to figure out where they affect your model and your strategies as you move forward. So with that, before we dive into the next section, I'll pause for a question if we have any. If not, I'll get going into the next section. Or is,
We're good to go right now, so carry on.
All right, here we go. So let's talk about compliance and marketing data. Again, in the digital world, everything around it sort of evolves around data, right? That is our oil, that's the blood that we operate our businesses on. So when you think about GDPR and email, you need to start thinking about where your subscribers are located, right? Because obviously we now have stricter regulations for consent. And the way that it's written in the law is that you have to be, if you're signing up for something as a consumer or the data subject, your consent has to be freely given, specific, informed, unambiguous. And if you do that as a marketer, you have complied with the sign up. So start to think about, preference centers, onboarding strategies, clear consent, mechanisms, links to your privacy policy. And again, these are just tenets of really permission-based programs, right? If you're the marketer and I log into the program or I opt into the program, I am, as the consumer, going to want to manage my digital relationship to the way that I think it should be managed, right? And if you give the consumer that power and the ability to do that, then you as the marketer will reap the ROI rewards of that individual, right? So it might be, a marathon, meaning, I may convert 3 or 4 or 5 times a year, but it's on my terms as opposed to the opposite way. So start to think about that. And again, if you've got any great sense to get out of here today and go get a tattoo, make sure it says no pre-check boxes, because that's stuff that's going to get people in trouble really quickly. Because again, you could demonstrate non-compliance if I'm forced to opt out of a pre-check box as opposed to opt in. You must provide adequate information on how the data is going to be used, meaning, I'm signing up for this, I'm not signing up for that. I'm signing up for the weekly newsletter and not the monthly newsletter, for example. I want email once a week as opposed to 4 times a month. Again, it gets kind of granular, but these are just real generic questions that I think we should all be thinking about. You've got to allow the user to say no and inform them of possible profiling, right? So profiling is going to be a big one, because I think that's going to be one of those pieces of legislation where you could demonstrate that you bought a pair of shoes, but you didn't want to get, a coat ad, or you didn't want to get, another piece of clothing, right? And so that's where I think marketers have to be a little bit sensitive in terms of how these customers are logging in, what they're going to get, when they're going to get it, and essentially the ability to manage that relationship with the brand directly, right? The burden of proof for the consent relies with all of us on the phone here. If we can't show consent, we have no backup, then we're in non-compliance, right? And the question that came up earlier about existing data, it does apply to all existing data. So as we talked about a moment ago, do you re-permission your files now? And then you need to start thinking about creating geo-specific sign-up processes, right? So one of the questions I got asked last week is, we have customers that come to our website from Europe, but they don't sign up for anything. Do I need to be GDPR compliant, right? Well, if they're not signing up for anything and they're just visiting your website, then the answer is no, right? But if they are signing up for stuff and you're saying things back to them, then and you're collecting data on them, then you need to start to think about how that's going to be looking from a regulatory perspective. Should you get into that conversation?
A question that we had come in, David, is asking about how does this apply to like social media and messaging?
That's a great question. So, you know, in a sense, you know, all things are based on consent, right? So, if you don't have consent from someone to share information or disclose what you're going to do with information, then you're going to get into hot water a little bit, right? And you're beginning to see that, I think, of some of the activities that you've seen around Facebook recently within the European Union, the right to be forgotten. I mean, they had 4.5, I think Google had 4.5 million requests for the right to be forgotten for their tracking. I think you're going to start to see more management consoles and the ability for a user to manage their distribution of data. And I think it's going to be a Facebook that's going to take it on the chin initially for all of us because they've been in the crosshairs of the regulators for many years now. So I think, you know, it's the same kind of concept of like forward to a friend of an email, right? Do you need to consent to forward an email to somebody? You know, and does that email have to be compliant? Well, you know, now it does, and now you have to have consent to do it. So I think it's making us all look at the programs that you run and say, okay, well, you know, does this make sense? Have I built privacy by design, which is a tenet of GDPR? Have I built that into my social media activity, for example, right? Or have I built that into my email campaign? Or have I built that into my SMS tracking, or whatever the case may be? So, you know, I think there's still early stages of how that's going to shake out, but there will be cases around that, right? Like over here, you have things like, hey, you know, I'm scraping LinkedIn for email addresses. Well, is that CAN spam compliant? You know, well, no, but you know, scraping an email address on LinkedIn to build a file is not necessarily a best practice, but it's not. You know, there have been cases recently where that's been, you know, disclosed as not being legal, but not being illegal, right? So it's kind of in the gray area. So I just don't really know what's going to happen in terms of long term. But I do say if you do have, you know, again, a social media strategy within your program, you need to start thinking about if you're disclosing consent or if you're not disclosing consent, because that, again, is low-hanging fruit. So yeah, I hate to be vague on some of these things, but we just don't know what's going to happen, right? And that's kind of like any law that goes into play. You know, when lawsuits come, they'll go through the court process, and we as all marketers will learn a lot more about, you know, what our obligations are going to be moving forward. But it's going to take that kind of activity for us to really get a good understanding of that. I mean, the GDPR is, you know, 99 chapters of legislation. There's 99 articles of legislation. There's 173 recitals based on the interpretation of those articles. So, you know, we're just talking about one of them today, right? So it is a deep and wide concept. So let's talk about GDPR on your website. There is a statement under the privacy fact sheet. Users must be in control of any privacy-sensitive information stored on their devices without having to click on a banner asking for their consent on cookies each time they visit a website. Browser settings are often an easy way to allow to refuse cookies. So you can see when I talked about the e-privacy directive earlier, you know, the cookie consent, and cookie management is mentioned directly in the GDPR legislation. So it's only a matter of time before we start to see the convergence of those two channels in terms of how, if I'm utilizing that technology for my program, how it's going to relate to privacy and privacy management. So it's still early days on that. As I said, mentioned in Recital 30, it's clearly stated that natural persons may be associated with online identifiers such as Internet Protocol addresses, cookie identifiers, other identifiers. So in the EU moving forward, things like IP addresses, cookie identifiers, etc., are what's called PII, right? Personal Identifiable Information. So it's going to get really granular in terms of identifying people based on this type of digital, digital footprints. Any cookie will identify uniquely attributed to a device and therefore capable of identifying an individual or treating them as a unique even without identifying them as personal data. So, the law has been, the gauntlet has been thrown down, right, in terms of what's on the crosshairs of permission. And, we don't think of PII over here as an IP address. We don't think PII as a cell phone identifiable code, right, but they do in Europe. So that's going to have an impact on how we continue to market once this whole thing is actually been fleshed out. Let's talk a little about marketing automation and GDPR, and this is just a couple of things a couple of slides that we talk about here. But in terms of being able to comply, right, one of the things that's really prevalent is list maintenance, and that should be a tenet of any kind of program, list maintenance hygiene. And as you can see, using the App-on platform, you can do that within the app itself, right, in terms of managing your unsubscribes, opt-in and opt-out tracking, communication permissions, given subscribers requirements. So again, if someone knocked on the door and said, "Hey, look, show me my communication preferences or show my opt-in status," and you can provide this backup, then you have attempted to comply with GDPR, right? So you definitely have that in-app. Adaptive forms, again, the ability to inform new subscribers what they are signing up for and obtain express consent to communicate. So on this particular example, there's me. I'm in Canada, for example, so you know that if you're a Canadian marketer, then you need to be concerned with Castle, but that could be Germany, that could be France, whatever the case may be. As you can see, my box is not pre-checked, and obviously that will take you to the, as you sign up, you get some permission, and you'll be able to do that from an adaptive form perspective. Segmentation is another way to be able to demonstrate consent and marketing automation, and obviously it allows your contact to be opted into list A and not necessarily list B. I'm getting certain things, and being able to set my preferences appropriately as it relates to me being the consumer in terms of my particular move, my particular example, expectations moving forward. And then finally, list management, right? You can identify and pull accounts that have not opted in a separate list for account-based marketing outside of the inbox. Meaning, hey, you don't want email, that's fine, but I can send you a letter and figure out, what your preferences might be moving forward as you start to go down that road. So, think about just using this technology to ensure or being able to attempt to comply with consent, right? Because consent is the key, as I said earlier, the key to any digital relationship, and that's really where the rubber meets the road. So, just a few examples there of how Act-On can provide that to you. And I think you're up, Danine, sorry.
Okay, so I've just got two quick slides about reducing the impact of GDPR on your marketing. Some of the things David has touched on, we're going to just kind of dive into those a little bit more. If you have any remaining questions, start thinking of those because we're going to start wrapping up in a couple minutes after I'm done with these. So, reducing the impact of GDPR on your marketing. As David mentioned, obviously you need to be prepared with, opt-ins for email, websites, and forms. That is all pretty straightforward. The one thing that he did talk about and that I want to go into a little bit more detail on is that fourth one there, consent for data analysis. That's when David was talking about profiling objections. So if you're trying to analyze patterns to profile buyers based on their habits or personas, you need their consent. If they decline that, you have to remove them from your data set. Now, obviously you might think, okay, well, if I have a data set that I'm analyzing and I keep removing people from it, that's going to complicate the level of personalization that I can do because my data isn't full, right? So it could hinder that that personalization that's so important to customer experiences, but it's really impossible to know exactly what those effects will be just yet. So it's just something to keep in mind. But that's one that's a lesser known or lesser talked about aspect of GDPR is that data analysis consent. So just be aware of that one. Written consent for event data. This one's an interesting one as well. Marketing consent is not implied just because somebody drops their card into your fishbowl. You can gain verbal consent. Verbal consent is legal if you inform them that their information might be used for marketing purposes. But as David mentioned, you do have to be able to prove that you are getting the right consent for things, so that documentation about that information. So the best approach to take would be to have them sign some form of written consent, so if you ever need to show that documented proof, you have it handy. So if they drop their business card in your fishbowl to win a prize, and you're going to use that information for something, you just say, hey, here's a little bit of information on that. Can you just sign this for us? If you're not comfortable with that, you pull your card out of the fishbowl. Because, as I said, verbal consent's legal, but how do you really prove that is the question.
Well, on that note too, if I may, Diane, on that note too,
yes,
I think one of the things I think you'll start to see at events and trade shows and the like is contractual language in the agreements for the provider of the show. Because obviously you're going to go to a show, they're going to share, the question comes up, can I share the data or can I share the attendee list? And I think you might find contractually some strategies around that, right? But you're right, if you're in the booth, you're absolutely correct. But I think if you're the provider of that event, it just makes sense to have some sort of contractual language in the agreement that a vendor would sign and also an attendee would sign, right, going into it, knowing that, hey, I have written consent on the deal that I've signed up, and that will take a little pressure off the folks like ourselves who are doing are in the booths and et cetera, et cetera. But again, burden of proof lies on the marketer, right? So that's something to think about.
Very important observation. And actually, we have another question about implied consent. Is there any implied consent based on being a customer who has purchased? So such as invoice, estimates, follow-up questionnaire on customer service or experience?
I think, again, there is an implied consent mechanism in Canada, for example. I have not seen one in the European Union, but the reality is if you have an existing business relationship with someone anyway, then why wouldn't you consider reaching out, and really sort of, utilizing that implied consent relationship or the EBR that you have anyway to formulate a more engaged situation, right? And that's okay, I think. I mean, provided you're doing it in the right way in terms of getting that consent. So I think it's one of those things where, there's been a lot of conversation around, well, B2B doesn't it's not GDPR, it doesn't have to be compliant with GDPR, and that's not necessarily accurate. I think what is accurate is using the tenets of compliance and consent in order to fulfill and establish that relationship moving forward. And if you already have that business relationship in place, then you're ahead of the curve. The secret sauce is going to be, the call to action that you deploy and how you strategize to engage that individual deeper in your program.
Awesome. Thank you, David. Okay, so the third one that we're going to talk about on this slide is just being careful of list buying. So a lot of experts are actually predicting that GDPR is probably going to be the end of at least the European data list industry. I could see that crossing over in a lot of ways. So as you transition to organic efforts, or if you're thinking about transitioning to organic efforts, in the meantime, if you continue to do list buying, just know that you are responsible for that. So the list supplier becomes the data processor once you purchase that list. So you're buying a list of personal data that makes you the controller in the eyes of the GDPR, and that makes you legally responsible. So you need proper documentation to know the origin of that data. Where was it collected? By whom? What was communicated to the data subjects about the purposes and storage period, etc. Individuals have the rights to know those facts if they ask, so you want to be able to answer them. You'll be lawfully obliged to hand out that information at their will. So,
definitely buy beware on that one. I couldn't agree more. Absolutely.
Yeah, we've basically nixed the list buying process. We did that about a year or so ago, but it was just in time because in general too, you don't really know the assurances when you buy the lists. Sometimes aren't very accurate, or the contacts that are in there anyway are not very accurate. So,
right.
It's better to just generate it organically, and then you actually know that a person is truly interested because you've had contact with that person.
Exactly.
So
exactly.
our last 3 points about reducing the impact of GDPR on your marketing is getting your team prepared. So every project, every campaign, every marketing initiative needs to have data privacy and protection in mind, as David did mention earlier. One consideration might be creating a handbook or a guideline sheet that each team member can reference. So if you have team members in different departments that are going to be handling the data differently, maybe creating a little checklist for each department. Here's things you need to keep in mind when you're handling data. Weighing inbound versus outbound marketing. So even though many experts are predicting GDPR will drive the number of new leads down and or potentially slow down the marketing efforts, there might be a plus side to that. By shifting your focus to more of these inbound-centric types of strategies, you can worry less about that quantity because more of your leads will be quality. So just think about it. If someone opts in for information, that is the clearest indicator you could have that they're interested in hearing from you, which makes them a higher quality lead. So get to work creating white papers, guides, ebooks, or whatever the other tools that your leads find useful so you have something valuable to offer them in exchange for their consent. And this idea of higher quality leads bleeds into your emails too. Right now, there's a lot of bombardment in our email inboxes by promotions, and there's so many so that we might not truly take the time to stop and look at them. So if you have less competing emails going to your audience, even though your audience is smaller, they might be more likely to look at yours because it is more relevant to them. And then lastly, alternate opt-in strategies on your website. So to offset some of those lost leads, try offering website visitors additional ways to opt in. So for example, if someone finds your product news page valuable, maybe they want to opt in for updates on it. Embed a form or a pop-up on that page that allows them to quickly opt themselves in. Same can be done for various other pages, like a video page. If they want an alert when you add a new video, give them that option. Maybe someone wants a summary of your recent blog posts emailed to them each week. So you can get creative, and you can just create these unique options for the content of your website pages to supplement, lost leads that you may get. Okay, and so get to our final slide here. Got a couple minutes left. Can you send mail to a company rather than a person and have it count as compliance? Does that comply? I'll give that one to you, David. I do not know.
Well, that's a great question. So essentially, there's two parts to that question, right? The question is, are you sending an email to a role-based email address within an organization? Things like sales at, info at, accounting at, whatever the case may be. If that's the case, those addresses essentially don't have consent on them because they're not real, right? They're role-based addresses are set up for functions and not people, right? So if you have role-based addresses on your files, I would be extremely careful about sending emails to those particular because you can't prove consent, right? Because a machine a role-based address essentially is a machine, and they can't sign up for anything. So the answer would be no. On the other side too, I mean, it doesn't stop it doesn't stop the ability for you to reach out. But again, if you don't have consent on the address, then it could get problematic for you.
Okay, as we wrap up here, we'll leave time for one or two more questions. If anyone has them, bring them in right now. But I would just like to take a moment to thank David for his wonderful insights and for being with us today. Also remind you, I didn't mention this before, but in the resources part of your console, there's also a link to register for our next webinar, which will be on April 4th. And that one, if you have a CRM system and you're interested in knowing how GDPR is going to affect your CRM system, and specifically the data within that system, things you can be doing around GDPR and your CRM, I highly recommend that you register for that webinar. Again, that webinar is on April 4th, and you can find that link in the widget on the bottom of your console. In addition to that, I will be sending a follow-up email to all of you between today and tomorrow that has some clips from this webinar and other important information that you might want access to. So thank you very much for being with us today. And I am not seeing any other questions come through, so I think that means we've got them all answered. So that makes me happy.
Excellent.
All right, thank you again, and thank you again to you, David. Everyone, enjoy the rest of your week and have a great day.
Thank you. Bye-bye.